Hello everyone. So this is going to be my first series of videos on Canada and World War II. And one of the main reasons I really want to make these videos is because as a Canadian, I feel that the Canadian contributions to World War II are somewhat overlooked and overshadowed due to the bigger, more epic theaters of war. And I really want to do this because I find a lot of these stories personally very interesting, and I find that not many people seem to be aware of Canada's contributions to fighting the Axis powers during the Second World War. Also, given that Canada is not really known as a fighting force, I feel like this gives me a great opportunity to tell you some of these stories. So, although Canada is a large country, it has a relatively small population due to most of it being unoccupied wildlands and tundra. And this is part of why I find it interesting that in 1939 Canada had a small army, but by 1945 it had a relatively large, well-trained, and capable fighting force, and certainly earned the reputation of being proficient fighters. So this is just a disclaimer. I'm not going to be doing these videos in any historical order. These are really just stories I find interesting and inspiring, and I thought I'd share them with you. The key to understanding the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary is the port city of Antwerp. Presently the second largest port in Europe, it is the most crucial port in Belgium. Because of its cargo capacity, the city needed to be taken by the Allies. World War II was almost certainly a battle of logistics. Getting the right materials in the correct quantity and in the right specific time was essential to maintaining battle readiness. By 1944, the French port of Dieppe was the only coastal port taken relatively easily with its docks intact, but was still limited to accepting only 7,000 tons of equipment a day. Previous attempts at taking other cities, such as Le Havre, Boulogne, and Dunkirk, were met with more difficulty and stiff German resistance. Even though all port cities on the English Channel had been captured by October 1st, the Germans had still successfully wrecked and demolished port facilities, and none could be restored until mid-November. As Canadian Major General A.E. Walford put it, a truck was now worth more than a tank. Supply problems were a real issue, and so Antwerp had to be taken. With 25 square kilometers of docks, 32 kilometers of waterfront, and 600 large cranes, some Allied logisticians estimated that the port could accommodate 40,000 tons of supplies a day. On September 3rd, General Bernard Montgomery had ordered the city of Antwerp to be captured, and on September 4th, the British 11th Armoured Division under command of General Miles Dempsey of the British Second Army began their attack. With the help of the Belgian underground and Canadian troops, the city's ports were thankfully seized before German engineers could detonate their explosives. Capturing Antwerp was one challenge, but the next task ahead lay in clearing the riverbanks and islands on the river Scheldt leading up to the port of Antwerp some 50 miles from the open sea. This meant that the ports of Antwerp were of still no use to the Allies, as the mouth of the Scheldt estuary was still under the control of the Germans. The new objective for the Canadians was to remove the German forces from in and around the surroundings of the Belgian town of Breskens. The Germans had been continuously being pushed back by the advancing Allies and now had created a defensive perimeter aptly named the Breskens Pocket. The next challenges for the Canadians were to clear out the Breskens Pocket and the islands of Walcheren, which being part of the Atlantic Wall were heavily defended. The islands of North and South Beveland were particularly concerning. Despite the entrenched enemy, the only way on or off North Beveland was by a series of narrow land bridges. Given that the Netherlands has gradually been retaken from the sea, the landscape is unforgivably flat. Aside from the long dikes meant as water barriers, there is very little cover for any advancing troops to be concealed by. The weather in October 1944 was exceptionally wet and cold. The polders were all below sea level, and that meant the only way to advance on dry land was exposed atop the dikes. There was much difficulty digging slip trenches, as they would all fill up with water. It was a dreary landscape. Operation Switchback, the title of the mission to clear out the Breskens pocket, was led by Canadian Major General Dan Spry of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. In opposition to them was the Wehrmacht's 64th Infantry Division, who were experienced fighters, well dug in and behind the natural barrier of the Leopold Canal. The division had been trapped when the British 11th Armoured and the 2nd Canadian Division isolated the Germans between the Leopold Canal and the North Sea. It was left behind when the 15th German Army fled behind the Scheldt earlier on October 2nd. Rather than surrender, the commander had chosen to fight. General Spry's plan was to bombard the German positions with around 325 heavy artillery guns preceding the advance of his 7th Infantry Brigade across the canal. After the 7th's advance, the 8th Infantry Brigade would follow suit, exploiting the opening in the German lines and advancing towards Breskens. Simultaneously, the 9th Infantry Brigade would commence an amphibious assault using buffaloes and terrapins against the pocket's northern shore. The assault began on October 6th, utilizing 27 Wasp flamethrowers attached to universal carriers. The Wasps were positioned on the Allied side of the canal and jettisoned their flames onto and beyond the German entrenchments on the other side of the riverbank. The effects were devastating, as the volleys of flame terrified the German troops. As the 7th and 8th Infantry Brigades began to advance, the 9th Infantry Brigade began its amphibious assault, crossing some 30 kilometers of open water. Their target, the beaches just east of the town of Hoofdplaat. The site was selected due to a Dutch resistance fighter spying a gap in the German defensive line. As the Canadians disembarked and advanced, they rapidly created a foothold over a mile wide. Quickly, the Canadians poured in reinforcement waves, ammunition, and supplies. Interestingly enough, they were accompanied by various elements of the British 79th Armoured Division, famously home of the Funnies. If you have not heard of the Funnies and you want to know more about them, there's a great series on YouTube about them from the Bovington Tank Museum. The Canadians advanced with 2 battalions, establishing bridgeheads. However, due to the low water table and the mud, they were unable to entrench themselves. The Germans rallied and fiercely counterattacked. Supported by heavy mortar fire and artillery, they then charged in their infantry. This was used to an effect where on one occasion they overran a company of Canadian Scottish. Despite the tenacity of the German attacks, Allied artillery concentrations and the use of tactical air power from the 84th Group 2nd Tactical Air Force of the RAF managed to hold the Germans back. The field HQ of both the RAF's 84th and the Canadian 2nd Army were located directly next to one another, allowing for highly organized planning, strategizing, and attack coordination. Despite how coordinated the Allied air attacks were, it still took over a week for the Leopold Canal to be bridged by the Canadian engineers in order for the Allied tanks to advance. The Canadians continued to push, and advancements had now squeezed the Germans into a much smaller pocket. By October the 19th, the enemy was mainly isolated to the town of Oostburg. After Allied artillery and rocket strikes pummeled the town, a frenzied bayonet charge from the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada ensured a German surrender. Come the 3rd of November, the towns of Naka and Zeebrugge were captured. The Breskens pocket had been closed, and the battle was over. Come the end of the battle, over 600 civilians had lost their lives. With them, 800 Allies had perished, and 1,325 Germans met their ends. This was but one aspect of the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary. Simultaneously, the struggles in capturing the Beveland Peninsula and the islands of Walcheren were still underway. I'd like to thank everyone for watching. This is my first video, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to my channel. I hope to make more videos like this in the future when I can. This took a lot of time and research to make, so I'll make a video whenever I can. Thank you very much.